Hey guys, tonight's topic might not be the loftiest in philosophy or the most glittering in legend, but it's greasy, peculiar, and just grounded enough to feel real. We're diving into the world of medieval junk food. Yes, even in an age without drive-thrus or vending machines, medieval folks weren't above snacking. They found ways to indulge, to treat themselves, to escape the monotony of salted cabbage and dried bread with small sizzling comforts. Some were tasty, others were outright strange. But all of them were rooted in the spirit of an era that didn't always prioritize flavor, yet still managed to create some delightful oddities. Let's start with a fried little miracle that carried the promise of joy in each risky bite. The apple fritter. Imagine it. Not your glazed donut from the corner cafe, but something more rustic, more dangerous, like a donut that had wandered through a muddy medieval alleyway and emerged both triumphant and a little burnt. The apples used in these treats weren't the glossy supermarket kind, bred for sweetness and shine. These were stubby, sour little rebels plucked from backyard trees or quietly borrowed from an unsuspecting neighbor's orchard. Lightly bruised, almost certainly gnarled, and tossed straight into a thick batter made from flour, eggs, and if the mood struck, a bit of ale. Water in those days could betray you. Ale, on the other hand, was cheer in liquid form. The real theater began when the batter met the fat. Frying something in the 1300s wasn't a delicate process. It was loud, unpredictable, and occasionally life-threatening. The oil of choice was pig fat, used and reused so many times it probably had a personality and an opinion on politics. That oil hissed and spat as it cooked, enveloping each battered chunk in a blistering coat of crispness. When done right, a fresh fritter was a thing of beauty, golden, crackling at the edges, tender at the core, and hot enough to sear a memory into your fingertips if you got too eager. If you were privileged enough to have sugar, real sugar, not the imagined sweetness of overcooked beets, you might dust a bit over the top. That, of course, signaled that you were someone of status. For the more grounded masses, a quick trickle of honey or some makeshift syrup infused with cloves or ginger did the trick. Even a touch of spice could transform the humble fritter into a momentary masterpiece, a reward for surviving another day in a world of dubious stews and watery porridge. These fritters weren't consumed behind closed doors or passed around quietly. They were fairground fare, market day treasures, the kind of treat you grabbed after prayer or between errands. Children begged for them, adults found excuses to buy them, and the occasional street hawk would swat away birds who'd grown bold enough to try and snatch one midair. And yes, sometimes they were a disappointment. The batter too gummy, the apple too sour, or the whole thing overcooked to resemble a charred lump of regret. But when they were good, truly good, they tasted like a reason to endure. And as one bite gave way to another, you understood something quietly profound. In a world often cold and cruel, where the comforts of life were few and rationed, this golden puck of fruit and fat was a rebellion, a sugar-kissed middle finger to blandness, a secret sizzling smile handed to you on a greasy scrap of linen. If apple fritters were the unexpected spark of joy you stumbled upon at the market or outside a chapel, then cheese curds were the quiet, humble companion that never asked for praise, but always showed up when needed. Unlike the drama of bubbling oil and golden crusts, these pale, lumpy bits of dairy didn't shout for attention. They didn't melt with flair or stretch like ribbons. No, they simply existed. Modest, squeaky, sometimes a little rubbery, and deeply satisfying in a way that didn't demand explanation. They were the closest thing the medieval palate had to comfort food that could be held in one hand and eaten in silence under a tree or while walking through the smoky haze of a village morning. Cheese curds were never meant to be elegant. They were never supposed to appear on the golden platters of feasts or serve to impress visiting dignitaries. In fact, they often came into being almost by accident, a byproduct of cheese-making that farmers and monks learned not to waste. The process began with milk, fresh if you were lucky, or just passable if you weren't. A bit of rennet, derived from the stomach lining of young animals and harvested with grim reverence, would be added to the milk, separating it into curds and whey. The whey was often discarded or fed to pigs. The curds, though, were gently salted and left just as they were, irregular, moist, and ready to be eaten or packed for travel. They were small, portable, and unfussy. You didn't need a plate or even clean hands to enjoy them. You just popped them into your mouth, maybe after brushing a bit of hay or dirt from your tunic. Some curds squeaked faintly against your teeth, a telltale sign of freshness that made children giggle and elders nod in approval. Others were more mellow, softened by time or the heat of the sun. And though their taste varied from batch to batch, sometimes sharp, other times barely there, they had a way of filling the stomach and quieting the nerves that made them a staple in cloisters and farmyards alike. Monks, those silent stewards of medieval gastronomy, often treasured cheese curds not just for their simplicity, but for their efficiency. In a world dictated by fasting calendars and meatless holy days, curds were both permissible and pleasing. Travelers would tuck them into satchels, hidden among dried apples and crusts of barley bread, knowing that when the roads were long and the inns uncertain, a few handfuls of curds could mean the difference between weariness and sustenance. Children treated them like sweets, snatching them from the kitchen when no one looked, sucking the salt from their surfaces as they ran barefoot across stone floors or dusty lanes. There was no ceremony to their presence, no ritual to their preparation. They simply appeared, on chopping blocks, in woven baskets, inside cracked pottery bowls. And yet, despite their lack of pretense, cheese curds endured in the hearts of those who lived by the rhythms of labor and prayer. They didn't need to be beautiful. They didn't aspire to grandeur. Their charm was in their reliability. They were food that asked for nothing but gave enough. In a time where spoilage was a constant threat and taste was often sacrificed for survival, curds managed to strike a rare balance. They weren't bold, but they weren't bland. They weren't extravagant, but they weren't austere. They simply existed at the quiet center of the medieval culinary world, ignored by poets perhaps, but remembered by stomachs. Even when they began to smell faintly odd or turn just a bit slimy from a warm day on the road, a little salt and a strong will could rescue them from the brink of waste. And when all else failed, when the stew pot was empty, when the bread had gone stale, when even the chickens refused to lay, a bowl of curds remained. Waiting. Familiar, honest. In a world of uncertainty, they were the edible version of trust. Turnips were never meant to be dessert. No child in a medieval village ever ran through the streets hoping to find a turnip tucked into a pie crust. But desperation, paired with a pinch of imagination and a complete lack of alternatives, often produced things that logic never would. Somewhere, in some chilly stone kitchen with smoke curling from a crooked hearth, someone looked at a pile of root vegetables and thought, maybe, just maybe, this could be made into something that didn't taste like disappointment. And so, the turnip pie was born, not because it made sense, but because there was nothing else. At its core, a turnip pie was a triumph of stubborn hope. The turnips, often oversized and underripe, were boiled or mashed into something soft enough to spread, then mixed with whatever scraps of luxury could be found that day. An egg, perhaps, if the hens had been generous. A spoonful of honey from a stingy comb. A handful of dried berries scavenged from last year's stores. Into the mixture went imagination, and into the crust went everything else. Flour, water, a bit of lard or dripping if luck permitted. This was no delicate pastry. It was armor, a thick, unleavened shield designed less to please and more to survive the baking fire. When it emerged from the oven, or more often, a soot blackened brick dome that called itself a communal bakehouse, the turnip pie looked plain, even humble. It was heavy, slightly cracked, with steam whispering out from the edge like secrets escaping a locked chest. You could cut it into wedges if you had a sharp enough knife. You could eat it with your fingers if you didn't. At its best, it was warm and earthy, with a faint sweetness clinging to the edges, as though the turnips themselves had tried their best to forget they were turnips. At its worst, it tasted like wet hay sealed in regret. Still, the pie served its purpose. It filled the belly. It lasted through the cold. It made use of what grew easily and without fuss. Turnips, after all, thrived where other crops failed. They could be buried, frozen, bruised, and still find a way to be edible. And so the pies became common. You'd find them at small fairs, lining the dusty tables outside churches, or handed from monk to traveler in roadside monasteries where culinary standards were far more forgiving than religious ones. No one pretended it was a delicacy, though some tried. A wealthy abbey might throw in nutmeg, a rare treasure carried from the East by merchants with stories and scars. A rogue cook might add black pepper, just enough to confuse the tongue and distract from the root. Occasionally, raisins were tossed in, not to improve the taste, but to imply that somewhere, somehow, someone cared. Even so, no noble would touch a turnip pie without a reason. It was food for the many, and not the mighty. Unless, of course, there was a feast day, a fast day, or a festival of humility in which nobles wished to show that they, too, could dine with the poor, briefly, politely, and preferably with servants holding perfumed cloths nearby. The pie endured because it had to, because people did, and because in a world where sweetness was rare, and luxury was something you heard about in church sermons, even a slightly sweet, slightly savory, faintly confusing wedge of root vegetable wrapped in browned dough could feel like a small blessing. Not a miracle. Not a feast, but a moment of something better than the usual, and so people kept making them. The recipes were never written down, only murmured from grandmother to daughter, passed along with a shrug and a just enough to hold it together kind of wisdom. The result was always different, sometimes dry, sometimes mushy, sometimes suspiciously gray, but always familiar, always enough. In its own way, the turnip pie was a monument to the human spirit, a celebration not of flavor, but of persistence, a dessert not born of joy, but of necessity dressed in crust. There was something almost mythic about the medieval meat pasty. Not because it was elegant or refined, but because it was everything the age demanded, rugged, mysterious, portable, and dangerous. It wasn't made to be admired. It was made to be eaten, preferably while standing, possibly while walking, occasionally while watching a public execution. In a world where meals had to survive rough roads, cold hands, and questionable hygiene, the pasty reigned supreme. It was, for all intents and purposes, the medieval version of a convenience meal folded in a tough crust, sealed with practicality, and baked until the outside was golden or burnt, depending on the mood of the fire and the patience of the cook. What lay inside was never guaranteed. Meat, in those days, was a word more flexible than modern sensibilities would prefer. If you were fortunate, you might bite into salted pork, maybe lamb or the tender remnants of a hare. But more often, what passed for meat was simply what had been caught that morning, or perhaps something older, left over from yesterday and revived with enthusiasm and spices. Rabbit was common. So were birds, both familiar and exotic. Pigeon, dove, even blackbird found their way into crusts. Fish, too, eels most often, or anything that flopped. And in the more remote parts of the realm, where imagination and hunger met in uneasy alliance, the fillings could include things best left unidentified: hedgehog, badger, squirrel, or the nameless creature that had wandered too close to a trap. But the glory of the pasty lay not in its ingredients, but in its design. The pastry shell was its armor, thick, chewy, and able to withstand dirt, wind, and fingers that had spent the day hauling wood or cleaning chamber pots. In mining regions, it was even thicker on one edge, a built-in handle of hardened dough so the eater could grasp it with soot-covered hands, eat the rest, and then toss the grimy crust to the earth, or, as some believed, to the spirits beneath the ground. There was a kind of superstition in that ritual, a gift to those unseen, or at least to the rats. Spices, when present, were both blessing and warning. A heavy hand with sage or pepper often meant the meat was past its prime. Garlic helped, ale helped more, but nothing could fully conceal the tang of something that had aged not with grace, but with stubbornness. Still, people ate them gladly, because in a time when lunch might be a crust of bread and a prayer, the pasty felt luxurious. Greasy, hot, rich with fat and possibility. You didn't ask what was in it. You took a bite, hoped for the best, and trusted your stomach to handle the rest. They weren't reserved for feasts or holidays. They were everyday fuel, carried in sacks, stacked on carts, sold in town squares by bakers with flour-streaked brows and too many children. Nobles had their versions, of course. Their pasties were larger, their crusts crimped with care, their meats sourced from royal hunts. A nobleman might unwrap a pasty with theatrical flair, perhaps served on silver, while a peasant would eat his beside a barn, boots muddy, eyes narrowed against the wind. Yet in both cases, the experience was strangely similar. One bite revealed everything, or nothing. To mark ownership, some workers etched their initials into the crust before baking. A simple letter, a crooked line. This one is mine, and if it went missing, well, one could always find the culprit by checking for grease-stained lips or the guilty crumbs in a pocket. There was something tribal about it, something deeply personal. A meat pasty wasn't just food, it was property, sustenance, and sometimes identity. There were even meatless versions, made with leeks, root vegetables, or cheese. These appeared on fasting days or in the kitchens of monasteries where flesh was forbidden but hunger was not. But make no mistake, it was the meat-filled pasty that captured hearts. The one that warmed cold fingers and made your tunic smell like hope and pig fat. It didn't promise delicacy, it promised endurance. So yes, they were mysterious. Sometimes tough, often greasy, but they were also honest in a way. Few things were. You didn't eat a pasty because it was beautiful. You ate it because you had miles to walk and no time for nonsense. You ate it because something inside you needed salt and heat and the thrill of not knowing if this bite would be beef or bird. And in that moment, as the crust cracked and the steam rose, you felt, for a fleeting instant, alive. In an age when personal hygiene was a precarious concept and brushing one's teeth often meant swishing a bit of wine and praying for mercy, a curious little invention emerged, small, fragrant, and coated in hard, shimmering sugar, candied fennel seeds. To the untrained eye, they looked unremarkable, no more than specks on a plate, brittle and glinting like bits of polished gravel. But for medieval diners, especially those in noble circles, they were something more. A final note to a heavy meal, a breath-freshening illusion, a digestive tool disguised as a treat, and occasionally a social signal wrapped in sugar. These tiny seeds had a peculiar boldness to them, packed with an herbal punch that walked the strange line between licorice and medicinal salve. Fennel itself had long been praised for its stomach-soothing properties, and the logic of the time, part tradition, part guesswork, part whispered superstition, held that ending a feast with something sweet and sharp helped balance the humors. And so, after courses of meat pies, roasted fowl, and puddings of dubious consistency, a host might offer a small dish of these candied seeds, served in ornate bowls beside goblets of warm wine and sleepy conversation. The sugar that coated them was no easy matter. Sugar was precious, laborious to refine, and expensive enough to be locked away in storerooms alongside spices and silk. Turning fennel seeds into candy required boiling syrup by hand, carefully coating each cluster again and again, then letting them dry just long enough to harden, but not long enough to clump. It was work for someone with time, patience, and servants, which meant, unsurprisingly, it was the wealthier households that embraced the practice. Guests might smile politely, pop a few into their mouths, and pretend not to wince at the burst of herbal intensity beneath the sugary shell. Others genuinely enjoyed them, savoring that strange combination of floral sweetness and anise-like bite that lingered long after the feast had ended. But these weren't just treats. They were, in their own way, tools. Tools for dignity. In a world where meals involved heavy meats, greasy sauces, and copious ale, the breath left behind was not always welcome in close quarters. A few fennel seeds crunched between the teeth could mask the scent of garlic or goose fat, at least long enough to mutter a parting prayer or flirt across a candlelit table. And the crunch itself, hard as it was, became part of the ritual. You didn't just chew them blindly. You tested the first one tentatively, aware that it could crack a molar if you misjudged the shell's density. You pressed it between your teeth, waited for that telltale sound, and only then dared the next bite. The common folk, of course, rarely tasted the genuine version. But imitation was the birthright of the poor, and so they made do with their own approximations. Seeds rolled in honey, dried herbs dipped in thinned syrup, or just crushed fennel mixed with resin and wishful thinking. It wasn't the same, but it was close enough to pretend. Close enough to feel for a fleeting moment that they too were participating in something refined, that they too could leave a meal feeling not just full, but somehow improved, cleaner, calmer, closer to grace. These seeds did not fill the belly. They did not carry weight or substance. They were, in the strictest sense, unnecessary. And yet they endured, passed across tables, slipped into pouches, offered to friends or flirtations like tiny gems. They didn't shout. They whispered, a final note in a symphony of smells and tastes, the last thing on the tongue before the candle was blown out. And though they may seem trivial now, a novelty at best, in their time they were a mark of taste, of thoughtfulness, and of a culture trying in its own fragrant way to balance indulgence with elegance. There are cakes that melt in the mouth, delicate and cloud-soft, crafted to impress, and then there are cakes that feel like they were forged in the same ovens used to bake bricks. Medieval honey cake was firmly in the latter category. It wasn't made to be airy or dainty. It was made to last, to sit on a table for days without spoiling, to be dropped, stepped on, picked back up, and still eaten. It was a cake that didn't ask for compliments. It just existed, dense, sticky, stubborn. A kind of edible endurance test that somehow became beloved. In a world where sugar was a guarded treasure, locked in storerooms and traded in whispered deals between spice merchants and nobles, honey was the sweetener of the people. If, and only if, you had access to bees. Sometimes the bees were kept in wooden hives by monks or villagers who braved stings and swarms for the golden reward. Sometimes you had to climb a tree and steal it, risking a broken limb and an angry cloud of wings. Either way, the honey wasn't casually used. It was hoarded, stirred slowly into dough with reverence and anticipation, not indulgence. The cake itself was made with the basics: flour, water, honey, and whatever else the pantry or imagination could spare. Eggs, if the hens had been cooperative. Spices, perhaps, if someone had recently returned from a trade port with a pouch of crushed clove or dried cinnamon bark. A handful of raisins, stolen before they turned to wine. These additions transformed the cake from a simple brick of sustenance into something that bordered on luxury. Each bite carried the possibility of surprise, a burst of dried fruit, a whisper of spice, and that alone made it feel like a celebration. The batter, thick and heavy, was poured into iron pans or earthen molds and placed near the hearth, where it slowly baked in the uneven heat of a fire that did as it pleased. There was no temperature control, no careful monitoring of crumb or color. The outside might burn while the center remained damp and chewy. But that was part of the charm. You slice the edges for the crunch. You save the middle for yourself. And if the whole thing came out tough enough to break a spoon, well, that just meant it would last longer. Honey cakes weren't just food. They were currency, bribes, tokens of affection, and sometimes pointed messages. A neighbor might offer you one as a sign of peace. A suitor might leave one at your door, wrapped in linen, heavy with intention. And if someone baked one just for you and spiced it generously, that meant something, because those spices weren't cheap. Every clove grated into the batter was a coin spent, a statement made. Here, I've given you something sweet. Let's see what you do with it. They appeared at weddings, stacked in clumsy towers, decorated not with icing but with the sticky sheen of baked-in syrup. At feasts they sat on wooden platters, their scent cutting through the smoke and grease like sunlight. They traveled well, tucked into packs, shared on the road or pulled from saddlebags at the end of a long ride. And when they got old, which they inevitably did, they didn't rot. They just hardened. Became chewy, then tougher, then eventually something you gnawed like a moral lesson. And still people loved them, not for their delicacy, but for what they represented, a moment of joy in a life ruled by necessity. They reminded you that sweetness could exist even in a world of ash and iron, that something sticky and golden and a little difficult to chew could still bring happiness, that sometimes the best treats weren't the ones that disappeared quickly, but the ones that lingered on your hands, your teeth, your memory. The honey cake didn't pretend to be refined. It didn't need praise. It simply offered itself unapologetically. A dense, glistening slab of comfort, heavy in the hand and slow to eat. The kind of thing that forced you to sit down, chew slowly, and remember, just for a moment, that life could be sweet. No one ever set out to make fried fish skin a delicacy. It wasn't invented in a moment of inspiration or planned as a dish to impress guests at a feast. No, it began the way so many things in the medieval world did, with leftovers. A pile of refuse, a cook staring at the remains of a meal half prepared, and a question that hovered in the smoky air like a challenge. What if we just fried it? And from that quiet act of culinary defiance was born one of the strangest and most satisfying snacks of the age: fish skin cracklings. It was a dish rooted in thrift, in the deeply ingrained fear of waste that governed every kitchen from seaside hut to noble manor. When fish was caught, processed, and butchered, no part went unused unless it had truly turned. The head might go to the cat, the bones to broth, the flesh to stews and pies. But the skin, slick, translucent, slippery as spilled oil, was usually tossed aside. That is, until someone realized that in hot fat it transformed, it hissed, curled, and crisped. It took on color, it changed texture, it became something crunchy, salty, almost delicate. The sound of it breaking between the teeth like leaves underfoot in autumn. Fried fish skin was not beautiful. It looked like shards of parchment soaked in the sea, twisted into strange shapes by heat and fate. Sometimes it still bore the ghost of a scale or two, and often it smelled, fiercely, unapologetically, of the ocean. But it was a revelation in the mouth. Crispy, light, faintly oily, and packed with the intense mineral tang of something that had once lived in the depths. It didn't pretend to be refined. It didn't offer sweetness or softness. But it gave satisfaction, the kind that comes from chewing something that bites back just a little. Coastal villages, river towns, and fishmongers' quarters all learned the trick. Cracklings were made in small pans over open fires, usually with reused fat that had seen better days, but still held promise. A pinch of salt was added if it could be spared, garlic sometimes, or dried herbs for the bold. But often it was served plain, naked, honest, bracing. You didn't need a plate. You cupped your hand or used a scrap of cloth. You ate them standing, crouching, walking. Soldiers tucked them into satchels, sailors stashed them in barrels, peasants sold them outside taverns where drunk patrons wanted something loud to chew. They weren't consistent. Some curled into tight spirals, others flattened like bark. Some snapped like twigs, others shattered into powder at the first bite. But that unpredictability was part of their appeal. A snack that defied control, that reflected the fire, the fish, and the mood of the cook. Sometimes you got a perfect piece, golden and warm, flecked with salt crystals like tiny stars. Other times you got something burnt and bitter, but still worth finishing. Because food, real food, didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to survive. And maybe surprise you, their only true failing was the smell. Cracklings announced themselves. The scent of fried fish skin lingered long after the fire had died down. It seeped into walls, hung in the air like a memory, clung to fingers and fabric and hair. Fry a batch inside and your home would smell like Poseidon's laundry for days. But no one complained. Not really. Because the taste made it worth it, because in a world of bland stews and grey porridge, this was a flavor that shouted. And so the humble crackling carved out a place in the medieval diet, not at feasts, not in ballads or cookbooks, but in the lives of those who knew how to make something out of nothing. A fisherman's wife, a monk in a cold monastery, a child too poor for bread but rich in curiosity. They all knew the secret, that if you had a pan, some heat, and a little leftover skin, you had more than a meal. You had crunch, you had salt, you had defiance, cooked in fat and eaten with your fingers. Bread soaked in ale was not a dish born out of desire. It was born out of absence, of flavor, of money, of better options. It was the meal you made when there was no meat, no cheese, no hope of eggs or herbs. It was what you ate when your cupboard was empty, your hands were tired, and your soul needed warmth more than complexity. In the medieval world, this was food not of celebration, but of survival. A quiet, sloshy ritual repeated in thousands of homes where hunger knocked and dignity remained, just stubborn enough to answer. There was nothing fancy about it. A heel of bread, old enough to draw blood from your gums, dropped into a bowl of ale, not because it sounded appetizing, but because it was the only way to soften something that had hardened into masonry. The bread, once fresh, fragrant, a comfort in itself, had long passed into the realm of the inedible. Its edges cracked like bark. Its center fought every tooth. But ale, thin and low in alcohol, brewed not for pleasure but for safety, was always there. Safer than water. Cheaper than wine and bitter enough to remind you that life was still working out its flavors. So you soaked the bread. Sometimes you tore it with your hands. Sometimes you crushed it with a wooden spoon. You waited as it swelled, softened, surrendered. And then, with no ceremony and no pretense, you ate it, slowly or quickly, alone or beside the hearth with others who had done the same thing countless times before. It was warm, it was filling, and it did not fight back. That alone made it precious. People called it by different names: sops, trench toast, ale bread. But the principle was the same. Take what is hard, combine it with what is bitter, and make something you can live on. And if you were lucky, there were extras. A scrap of cheese shaved thin, a sprinkle of herbs dried and forgotten in a jar. If the hen had been generous that morning, perhaps even a fried egg with its edges crisp and curling, slid on top like a prize from the gods. These embellishments were rare. They were moments, not expectations, but they elevated the mushy mass from something endured to something remembered. On feast days, the cook might reach for a spice jar, nutmeg if fortune smiled, or a twist of pepper if chaos ruled the kitchen. Ale might be warmed, infused with clove or anise, poured over the bread with the solemnity of a blessing. In those moments, the dish flirted with elegance, but it never quite got there, because no matter how you dressed it, it was still soaked bread, still yesterday's crusts, still the reminder that even when abundance danced elsewhere, you could make do with what you had and still walk away full. And this dish, this soggy, strange, quietly beloved meal, did more than fill stomachs. It stretched ingredients. Bread too stale to chew had one more purpose. Ale too flat to drink found a second life. Waste was not an option. Every scrap mattered. Every swallow was defiance. You didn't need a feast to feel human. You just needed warmth in your bowl and something that didn't bite back. There was, of course, a downside. It didn't travel. Once soaked, the bread collapsed into a lumpen sponge, weeping ale and surrendering structure. You had to eat it quickly or lose it to time and gravity. But on cold nights, with the wind against the shutters and the fire burning low, there was comfort in its messiness. It reminded you that food didn't have to be perfect. It only had to be present. So yes, if you've ever looked at a loaf of stale bread and thought, I wonder what this would be like if I drowned it, congratulations. You've shared a thought with generations of medieval peasants. They did it first. They did it out of necessity. But sometimes, just sometimes, they found something tender in the sogginess, a moment of softness in a hard world. And that, in its own quiet way, was nourishment too. Some dishes were born from scarcity, others from extravagance, but then there were those that seemed to emerge from somewhere in between. Not from hunger, not from wealth, but from a desire to transform something humble into something poetic. Sops in wine belonged to that peculiar middle ground, a dish that straddled ritual and eccentricity. To describe it simply is to rob it of its mystery. It was bread soaked in wine. But to stop there would miss the point entirely. Because for those who partook, nobles leaning back in candlelit halls, priests nursing thoughts deeper than prayer, or guests trying not to ask too many questions, this wasn't just a bite of soggy toast. It was, depending on the context, dessert, indulgence, spiritual metaphor, or a gentle end note to an evening too rich in everything else. It began with the bread, ideally toasted, or at least not so stale it disintegrated upon contact. A slice thick enough to hold itself together, but not so firm that it resisted the softening ritual. The wine, too, was carefully chosen. Not the fresh kind, but something older, warmer, mulled perhaps with cinnamon, cloves, and a touch of honey. Wine that had waited in the dark for the right moment to emerge. Into this, the bread was dipped, slowly, deliberately, like an offering. And then it was served. Not held in the hand, but in a bowl, perhaps with a spoon. This was not finger food. It was something you approached slowly, as if the very act of eating demanded quiet. And it did. This was not a meal for the marketplace or the roadside. It was not served in the rush of day, but in the hush of night, when conversations turned soft and the candles burned low. It appeared after the meat had been carved, after the laughter had died down, after the last toast had been made. A dish for those who lingered, who thought too much, who preferred subtlety over splendor. It was warm, fragrant, and mildly intoxicating, a comfort without clarity. The wine wrapped around the bread, filling its pores with memory, turning it into something new, something that was no longer quite bread, no longer quite liquid. Sometimes it was adorned. Raisins, dried figs, even crushed almonds might be added, swirling in the bowl like forgotten dreams. Occasionally, a soft cheese or even a poached egg made an appearance, transforming the dish into something altogether stranger. No two versions were quite the same. It could be thick, like porridge, or thin, like soup. Sweet, bitter, earthy, or floral, depending on the hand that prepared it. And that was part of the appeal. It resisted definition. To nobles, it whispered elegance. To guests, it whispered mystery. And to cooks, it whispered a quiet freedom, a chance to improvise, to experiment, to repurpose. Bread that had dried on the table yesterday became tomorrow's indulgence. Wine too old to serve on its own became the soul of a new creation. Nothing wasted. Everything transformed. And while the upper classes called it dessert, the lower classes called it survival. Their version substituted wine with ale, or even vinegar mixed with water and herbs. The result wasn't celebratory, it was necessity in a bowl. Yet it too carried warmth. It too softened hard crusts and weary spirits. It reminded even the poorest among them that transformation was possible, that even a crust of bread could become something soft, something bearable, something almost beautiful. Still, in noble halls, it retained its air of refinement. Musicians might play softly while spoons tapped bowls. Courtiers might speak in low tones, letting the scent of spiced wine carry them toward sleep. And in the silence between bites, something settled. A pause, a reflection, a slowing of the world. Because in the end, sops in wine weren't about flavor. They were about texture, warmth, and timing. They were about closing the evening gently, about soaking away the sharpness of the day. They were about simplicity elevated to ritual. And in a time when much of life was hard and fast and loud, this was a moment of softness, a moment to breathe, a moment to taste the quiet. Dried fruit, in the medieval imagination, was a thing of wonder. Not because it was beautiful. It wasn't. And not because it tasted like ambrosia. It didn't. But because it had journeyed. Through time, through distance, through hands and heat and hunger. A shriveled raisin, a hardened date, a flattened fig. These were more than just edibles. They were tokens of resilience, of sweetness preserved, not given, of indulgence earned. They came wrapped in cloth, stored in ceramic jars, passed down like whispers through winters too long and harvests too lean. The fruits themselves were often modest before drying. Grapes that might have fermented if left too long on the vine, plums starting to wrinkle, figs already half split by the sun, but drying gave them a second life, a tougher one. Exposed to the air, laid out on rooftops or hung near hearth fires, they lost moisture and gained intensity. Their skins toughened, their sugars sharpened, their bodies grew small, tight, and strangely powerful. You didn't bite into dried fruit, you worked through it, slowly, thoughtfully, often with a wince. They weren't soft, not usually, not unless they'd been soaked in wine or wrapped in damp cloth to soften the edges. A fig might resist your teeth like old leather. A date might glue itself to your molars with sticky insistence. Raisins lodged themselves between teeth and refused to come out without negotiation. And yet, despite the challenge, people loved them. Perhaps because of it. Because they required effort. Because they didn't give themselves away easily. In noble halls, dried fruits were laid out with ceremony. Not in heaping bowls, but in neat rows on wooden trays, perhaps with a bit of honey drizzled over top or a sprinkle of crushed nuts. They were served between courses or at the end of meals, a sign that the household could afford not just fresh fruit in season, but the space, patience, and labor to dry them for later. A tray of imported prunes said something. A handful of golden raisins said even more. It was sweetness in the dead of winter, sugar in a time before sugar was common. But for the common folk, dried fruit was a kind of myth, something they saw once or twice a year, perhaps at a wedding, or when a merchant passed through with foreign goods wrapped in cloth and secrets. Children might be handed a single fig, sticky and dark, and told to make it last. And they did. They savored it with reverence, with awe, hiding in barns or behind cottages so they wouldn't have to share. It was candy before candy existed, a treat that felt like treasure. Storage was its own ritual. Dried fruit didn't spoil easily, which made it precious. It could be hidden in pouches, tucked into clay pots, strung up in rafters like ornaments. Over time it hardened, became more difficult to chew, more intense in flavor, but that only added to its value. It lasted, through seasons, through scarcity, through silence, and it wasn't just for snacking. Dried fruits were chopped into porridges, added to stews, or folded into cakes and pies to give the illusion of richness. A plain barley loaf could become something magical with just a few raisins pressed into the top. A bit of fig could transform a bowl of gruel into something resembling pudding. They were tokens of variety in a diet that often knew only sameness. Still, their toughness was legendary. Figs came with seeds that cleaned your teeth whether you wanted them to or not. Dates glued your lips shut in a way that discouraged conversation. Prunes were unpredictable. And raisins, well, they hid in your mouth for hours, showing up in your smile long after the meal had ended. But no one minded, because sweetness was rare, and sweetness that kept, that lasted, that could be hoarded and shared and hidden, was worth every sore jaw. So when someone gifted you dried fruit, it wasn't just food. It was affection, it was generosity, it was memory, preserved. And when you took a bite, even if it tugged at your teeth and made your jaw ache, you chewed with gratitude. Because in that shriveled fruit was a piece of sun, a trace of the season that had passed, and the silent promise that sweetness, however small or stubborn, could survive. There are meals that nourish, meals that comfort, meals that dazzle. And then there are meals that challenge, that dare you to bite, that meet you with a stare. Blood pudding bowls were that kind of food, dense, dark, unapologetic. They weren't made to please, they were made to use everything, to waste nothing, to take what the world offered, even its most iron-laced, slippery remnants, and turn it into fuel. Not elegance, not pleasure. Fuel. You didn't eat them because you were hungry for flavor. You ate them because you were hungry. Full stop. The making began with blood, fresh, warm, and gathered quickly before it congealed. Pig's blood was common, though in truth any animal would do if it came from a proper kill. It was mixed with oats for bulk, onions for sharpness, and suet, the soft fat around organs, to give it cohesion and energy. Spices might follow depending on who was cooking and how recently they'd seen a market. Sometimes pepper, maybe sage. Clove, if someone had a generous neighbor. The mixture, once stirred, became a thick, glistening mass, somewhere between batter and paste, rich with the scent of iron and smoke. Then came the shaping. The cook would wet their hands, roll the mixture into balls the size of a clenched fist, and drop them into sizzling fat, usually lard, sometimes reused, always angry. The kitchen would fill with smoke and the sound of hissing. The balls crisped on the outside, blackening slightly, sealing in their grim treasure. When finished, they were heavy, solid, warm enough to fog a window if pressed against it, and they smelled, not unpleasant, but unmistakable, earthy, meaty, alive. To bite into one was to surrender. The crust gave way to a moist, grainy interior that clung to your teeth and left behind the taste of marrow, of cooked blood, of something ancient and true. You didn't nibble blood pudding. You consumed it, with determination, with reverence, or at least with a firm jaw and a quiet sense of duty. It filled you fast. 2 were a meal. 4 meant you'd likely not eat again until dusk. They were rich in a way that medieval food rarely was. Not with sugar or spice, but with fat and iron and the memory of what had once pumped through a living body. The wealthy dressed them up. They might serve blood pudding balls with roasted apples, or lay them beside eggs and a goblet of dark ale. They pretended it was a delicacy, as if the blood had been summoned from a silken vein rather than scooped from a wooden bowl behind the slaughterhouse. The poor made no such pretense. For them, it was meat without bone, warmth without firewood, and sustenance that traveled well. You could wrap 3 in cloth, carry them on the road, and they'd still be edible a day later. Maybe not tender, maybe a little greasy, but edible. Markets sold them wrapped in parchment or stacked in baskets. Fairs smelled of them. Taverns used them to soak up drink. Children ate them, wide-eyed and wary, not yet old enough to understand what they were tasting. And some didn't like them, their texture, their richness, their truth. Because food made of blood reminded you of death, of the cost behind nourishment, of the closeness between survival and slaughter. But most accepted it, because in a world of turnips and broth and hard bread, this was something else. This was warmth. This was strength. This was meat you didn't have to chew through sinew to reach. And yes, they could be grim. They could be overcooked or undercooked or cold and congealed by the time they reached your hands. But they were also oddly comforting. The kind of food that said, we didn't waste. We took what remained. We turned it into power. And power, in the Middle Ages, was rarely beautiful. But it was necessary. There are foods that aim to please. Others aim simply to exist. Medieval pancakes belonged squarely to the latter group. They were not fluffy. They were not golden discs stacked with care and doused in maple syrup. They were flat, fried with reckless abandon, and more survival mechanism than celebration. But in a world where breakfast was often nothing more than a thin broth or a scrap of bread too hard to chew, even these lopsided, greasy rounds offered comfort. Not because they were beautiful, but because they were warm. They began, as so many medieval things did, with what was available. Flour, coarse, often gritty, mixed with water or ale, depending on what was safer or more cheerful that morning. Eggs, if there were any. Maybe a pinch of salt or a fistful of chopped onions, torn herbs, or grated cheese if the larder was feeling generous. But usually not. This was food stripped of decoration. This was batter for the people. The pan was iron, hot, and slicked with lard that hissed and spat at the touch of the mix. Ladled in without ceremony, the batter spread itself thin, bubbling and browning in uneven circles that bore no resemblance to the tidy pancakes of modern imagination. The edges might curl, or crisp, or burn. The center might remain a little undercooked. Or not. Each pancake was a guess, an edible gamble, made under the eye of a tired cook in a smoky kitchen where control was more a suggestion than a guarantee. And yet, when they were done, when they slid from pan to plate, still steaming, still clinging to the scent of the fire, they were met not with judgment, but with hunger. Because these pancakes, humble as they were, filled a space that needed filling. They were fried, they were filling, they were real. You could roll one up and eat it while standing, tear it with your hands, dunk it into broth, wrap it around leftover vegetables or even a sliver of meat on lucky days. They were tools as much as food, vessels for whatever you had, however little. Everyone ate them. Nobles, peasants, monks, pilgrims. Some layered them with cheese. Others stacked them with fried onions or drizzled whatever thin honey they had on top. Most just ate them as they were, hot, greasy, slightly chewy. A taste not of indulgence, but of familiarity. A pancake that didn't try to impress. A pancake that said, I am what I am. Take it or leave it. And most took it gladly. On fasting days, when meat was off the table and guilt was on the menu, pancakes became a kind of loophole. You couldn't eat beef, but you could eat batter fried in fat. You couldn't indulge, but you could fill your stomach with something heavy enough to silence it. Pancakes walked that line. Plain enough to be permitted. rich enough to be appreciated, especially when there was nothing else. Leftovers were stacked in cloth, eaten cold or reheated if there was fire to spare. Sometimes they became part of something else, torn into soup, stuffed with greens, crumbled into scraps and mixed with broth to make a second meal. And still, they persisted. Still, they returned. Because they were easy to make, hard to ruin, and strangely satisfying in their simplicity. And though no bard ever sang of pancakes, though no mural ever painted their humble form, they left their mark, not in beauty, not in legend, but in memory. In the quiet way they showed up day after day without complaint, in the way they soaked up grease and expectation alike, in the way they fed people who had little else and asked nothing in return. Wafers were the lightest of medieval foods, not just in texture, but in spirit. They arrived without fanfare, slipped into meals between heavier courses, or handed out by street vendors with little more than a nod. But despite their fragility, or perhaps because of it, they were beloved. Thin as a whisper, crisp as parchment, they floated through feast halls and churchyards alike. Never quite a dessert, never quite a bread, always somewhere in between. A wafer didn't try to fill you. It didn't carry spice or richness or complexity. It simply cracked on the tongue and vanished. They were made from little: flour, water, sometimes eggs. That was it. No yeast, no sugar unless fortune smiled. No filling, no layers. The batter was thin and poured into heated irons. Long-handled tools forged in blackened kitchens, their metal plates etched with patterns both sacred and mundane. Some bore crosses, some flowers, some only the tired indents of years of use. The irons were pressed together, held over flame or coals, and when they were opened, slowly, carefully, the result was something miraculous in its own quiet way. A wafer, round or square, flat and delicately browned, warm to the touch, and gone before you could ask for another. They were eaten everywhere. Monks made them in abbeys. Bakers made them in cities. Women sold them outside churches on feast days, calling softly to the faithful as they exited Mass, waving their baskets like offerings. It wasn't indulgence they were selling. It was ritual, a way to mark the moment, the end of service, the passing of a saint's day, the turn of a season. The phrase, "buy now, sin later," was never said aloud, but it hung in the air all the same. Nobles, of course, had their versions, layered with soft cheese or served with candied fruit, even drizzled in rare syrup if the table demanded spectacle. But the basic wafer remained unchanged because it didn't need to evolve. It had nothing to prove. It was humble, honest. It didn't pretend to be cake or biscuit or bread. It was itself. And yet, it carried meaning. It carried memory. Its lightness was deceiving. A wafer could be a prayer, passed from hand to hand in silence. It could be a celebration, crunched between laughter and music. It could be a goodbye. One last taste before a journey, before a fast, before a farewell that might last longer than planned. Because wafers traveled poorly. They cracked under pressure, crumbled in sacks, dissolved in damp air. You didn't keep a wafer for later. You ate it now, before wind or time or carelessness stole it from you. Some were stamped with the faces of saints or symbols from scripture, not because it changed the flavor, but because it gave you something to look at while chewing, something to think about, something to hold on to. A tiny circle of wheat and air, bearing the weight of meaning far greater than its ingredients. They were made in bulk, dozens at a time, hundreds if the festival called for it. Children followed vendors like sparrows, hoping for a broken one, a discarded piece, anything they could snatch and savor. Adults bought them without looking, ate them without speaking. They were the medieval version of a treat that didn't feel sinful. A pause, a breath, a moment of sweetness that left no stain. And when you held one, Light, warm, patterned with centuries of repetition, you understood its power. Not to feed, not to dazzle, but to remind. That in a world heavy with obligation, noise and hunger, there was still room for something delicate. Something that asked nothing, gave little, and yet was remembered. The way a snowflake is remembered. Or a kiss. Or the last note of a song. If honey cake was the dessert of the people, then suck it was the dessert of the chosen. It was not baked by accident or stirred absent-mindedly beside the hearth. It was crafted slowly, deliberately, by hands that understood not only sugar, but spectacle. It was fruit, yes, but not as nature intended. It was fruit conquered, boiled in syrup until it gleamed like glass, sealed in jars like treasure, preserved not just for flavor, but for drama, because suck it, more than anything, was about presence. It announced itself. It arrived like a jeweled guest at the table, daring you to look away. The process began with the best of what could be spared. Oranges if you were wealthy enough to trade with the South. Dates and ginger for those with connections deeper than local soil. Sometimes even rose petals or citron found their way into the pot. Whatever the choice, the fruit was peeled, sliced, and submerged in a syrup made not merely of honey or cheap sweetener, but of sugar. White, crystalline, precious. Sugar was not pantry stock. It was locked in chests, counted, measured, guarded. To use it on fruit, not for healing, not for preserving medicine, but for pleasure, was a statement louder than any word. And so the syrup was boiled, thickened, stirred for hours over open flames, watched with a concentration usually reserved for prayers or poisons. The fruit softened, then darkened, then began to shine. Sometimes the mixture was drained and reboiled, again and again, until the pieces within resembled stained glass more than anything edible. The goal was transformation, not just in taste, but in form. You were not eating fruit anymore. You were eating its memory, its ghost, suspended in sweetness. When finished, the sucket was jarred. In glass if the household was rich, in glazed clay if not. It could be served wet, floating in syrup, soft and clinging. Or it could be dried slightly, dusted with more sugar, and cut into tiny cubes that stuck to your fingers and your conscience. Because the moment you tasted it, you knew what it cost. Not just ingredients, but time, labor, and a sense of untouchable wealth. It wasn't for everyone. Not because of taste, but because of class. Sucket didn't appear in farm kitchens or alehouse corners. It appeared in noble halls after feasts that had already tested the limits of indulgence. It was passed around on ornate trays, lifted delicately by fingers that wore rings. You didn't take a handful. You took one piece, maybe two. You bit, slowly. And then you smiled, graciously, hungrily, or with envy hidden beneath good manners, because that little shard of candied fruit told a story. It told everyone present that you had access to sugar, to trade routes, to the kind of life where fruit didn't spoil but became immortal. It was also a gift, one that said everything words could not. I thought of you. I spent hours making this. Or, more honestly, I had someone spend hours making it for me. Sucket might arrive at court wrapped in linen, sent with a seal and a signature. It might be placed in a marriage basket, beside gold coins and embroidered cloth. It might be used to calm tempers, win favor, or simply impress. And often it worked. Because sweetness has always been a shortcut to memory. Common folk saw sucket from a distance. They smelled it when they worked in noble kitchens. They stirred it under the orders of mistresses they dared not speak to. And if they were lucky, truly lucky, they might taste the spoon when no one was watching. Just once. A lick of syrup from a wooden ladle quickly wiped away, but it was enough to remember, and the memory lingered. Sweet, intense, dangerous, Because once you tasted that kind of luxury, it never quite left your mouth or your dreams.